The palace of Zytherian Prime stood high above the clouds, made of silver walls that shone even in darkness. Every corner of it buzzed with servants, guards, and machines, all working for the great alien king, Vorth. Among them moved a single human, a quiet janitor named Gene Park. He was small compared to the tall, scaled aliens around him. His gray uniform was simple, and his hands were always covered in dust and oil. While the nobles argued and the soldiers shouted, Gene worked silently. He mopped the floors, cleaned the broken lights, and fixed the small machines that everyone else ignored. No one really noticed him. When aliens passed, they barely looked down. To them, humans were a weak species, primitive, slow, and simple-minded. Gene never argued. He only smiled politely and kept working. He knew his place, and that was enough for him. But Gene noticed everything. As he cleaned the halls, he heard things others missed. The guards whispered about rebellions on the outer colonies. The servants spoke of the king's anger. Even the palace lights flickered strangely, as if something unseen was breaking deep inside the walls. Every day, Gene followed the same routine. He started before dawn, sweeping to the grand halls where golden statues of warriors lined the walls. Then he checked the lower maintenance tunnels, fixing what the engineers forgot. Sometimes he paused to look out through the crystal windows at the endless sky of Zytherian, a sea of clouds glowing red under twin suns. He liked the quiet moments. On Earth, he had once been an engineer, but wars had destroyed everything. When he came to Zytherian as a refugee, he could only find one kind of job, cleaning, but he didn't mind. The work gave him peace. One evening, as he was scrubbing near the royal fountain, he heard footsteps echoing across the marble floor. He turned and froze. It was King Vorth himself. The king's armor glimmered like black glass, and his tall crown cast sharp shadows on the floor. The guard stayed at a distance. Gene bowed quickly and stepped back. Vorth barely noticed him at first. He stood in front of the fountain, frowning. The water barely flowed, sputtering from broken pipes. "It has been weeks," the king said coldly. "Not even my engineers can repair this." Gene looked at the pipes and saw the problem instantly. The filter was clogged with mineral dust from the upper vents. He hesitated, unsure if he should speak. Finally, he whispered, "It's not broken, Your Majesty. It's just blocked." The king's eyes narrowed. "And you know this how?" "I used to fix systems like this," Gene said quietly. "If I may..." Vorth gestured for him to continue. Gene knelt by the fountain, opened a panel, and carefully removed the dusty filters. With a soft hum, the water began to flow again, clear, smooth, and steady. The king watched silently as the fountain came back to life, the sound of running water filling the hall. Vorth's expression softened for a moment. "You fixed what my engineers could not. It just needed a little care," Gene said. "Sometimes, things don't need to be replaced. They just need someone to listen." The king said nothing. He stared at the human janitor for a long time, then turned and walked away. Gene watched him go, unsure if he had done something right or wrong. When the king disappeared around the corner, Gene went back to cleaning. That night, as he finished his shift, he thought about the king's face. There had been something strange in his eyes. Not anger, but confusion, maybe even sadness. Gene wondered what kind of weight a ruler like that carried. Days passed, and the palace felt heavier. The servants whispered about the council fighting over taxes. The guards argued about new laws, and the king was rarely seen. But Gene kept to his work, silent as always. When others complained about chaos, he quietly repaired broken lights. When others shouted, he cleaned the mess left behind. Sometimes, he saw the king passing to the halls, always surrounded by advisors. Their voices were sharp, filled with pride and fear. Vorth never looked at Gene again. But once, Gene thought he saw the king glance his way, just for a second. Gene didn't know it then, but that small moment, the sound of water returning to the fountain, the quiet voice of the janitor speaking truth without fear, had planted a seed in the king's mind. For now, Gene returned to his silent work. He swept the shining floors until they reflected the stars through the great glass windows. Outside, lightning danced between clouds. The galaxy moved on, full of noise and power, but within the palace walls, one human continued his quiet duty. He was just a janitor, unseen and forgotten. Yet, somewhere deep in the heart of the kingdom, something had begun to change because of him. Days turned into weeks, and the palace's Itherian prime grew quieter. But the silence was not peace. Whispers filled the air like cold smoke. Whispers of rebellion, lost fleets, and a king losing his grip. Gene Park heard them all as he mopped the long marble halls and polished the silver doors. The palace still glittered under the suns, but the shine was thinner now. Cracks appeared on the golden tiles, not from time, but from neglect. The engineers were busy with war machines, not repairs. The nobles were busy arguing, not ruling. Only Gene seemed to notice the small things breaking. Lights that flickered, locks that jammed, panels that hummed strangely. He fixed what he could, quietly. No one thanked him, but he didn't need thanks. He did it because he couldn't bear to see things fall apart. One night, while cleaning the great audience chamber, Gene found a small piece of the king's throne lying on the floor, a piece of dark stone cracked straight through. He picked it up and turned it in his hands. It looked heavy, but it was surprisingly fragile. He wondered if the king even knew his throne was breaking. Then he heard voices echoing down the hall. Gene quickly stepped back into the shadows. Through the open doorway, he saw 3 of the king's advisors arguing. "The frontier planets refuse tribute again," said one. "They claim the king has grown weak." "Then send the royal fleet," another shouted. "Crush them before more follow." A third voice, softer but sharper, replied, "The fleet won't listen. Even the generals question his rule." The first advisor hissed, "Then it's only a matter of time before someone else claims the crown." Gene stood frozen. The king's rule, on the edge of collapse? He didn't understand politics, but he understood what it meant when people stopped believing in their leader. It was like when a machine lost its power. First it shook, then it fell apart. The next morning, Gene was sent to clean near the royal gardens. The once beautiful place was overgrown, the fountains dry again. The flowers that used to shine with strange colors had wilted. He was about to sweep fallen petals when he noticed someone sitting alone on a stone bench. It was King Vorith. He was not wearing his armor, only a long dark cloak. His crown was gone. He looked tired, older than before. The king turned slightly when he saw Gene. "You again," he said in a calm voice. Gene bowed quickly. "Forgive me, your majesty. I didn't mean to disturb you." "You did not," said the king. "It seems only you walk these halls anymore." Gene hesitated. "Maybe they're afraid, sire." The king gave a small, bitter smile. "Afraid of a ruler who cannot hold his throne?" Gene looked down at the cracked stone near his feet. He wanted to stay silent, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. "A throne can be repaired, your majesty, but only if you see the cracks before they spread." Vorith raised his eyes. "You think I did not see them?" Gene met his gaze. "Sometimes seeing is not enough. You have to care enough to fix it yourself." The king said nothing for a long time. The wind stirred the dry leaves around them. Then, to Jin's surprise, Vorith asked quietly, "Tell me, human, do your people fix what is broken, even when it is not theirs?" Gene nodded. "If we don't, no one will." The king stared at him for a moment, then stood. "Perhaps that is why your kind survived when others did not." He walked away slowly, his cloak brushing the ground like fading shadow. That night, as Gene cleaned the upper halls, he saw something he hadn't seen in months. The king speaking to his generals not with anger, but calmness. His voice carried through the hallways, steady and strong. It wasn't the voice of a ruler shouting commands, but one asking questions, listening carefully. Gene smiled faintly. Maybe his words had meant something. Maybe the king had started to listen, not just to him, but to everything around him. Still, the cracks were growing faster. Reports of battles losing light came from every planet. The palace guards looked nervous. The nobles whispered louder. And then one day, as Gene was repairing a broken floor vent near the throne room, the alarms began to sound. A red light flashed along the ceiling, and alien guards ran through the halls shouting in their strange language. An officer stopped near him. "The outer defenses are breached. An attack from within the capital." Jean stood still as panic filled the palace. He didn't know who was attacking, but he knew one thing. The cracks he had seen were no longer just in the stone. They were in everything. The kingdom, the throne, and maybe even the king's heart. When the noise faded, Jean found himself alone again in the empty halls. The broken piece of throne still lay in his pocket. He turned it in his hand, feeling its sharp edge. Everything breaks eventually, he thought, but maybe, just maybe, it could still be fixed, if someone cared enough to try. As the red lights flashed in the distance, Jean went back to work. He didn't know why, but something deep inside him whispered that the story wasn't over. Not yet. The palace had not known peace for many days. Fires had burned across the outer districts, and the once bright towers of Zytherian Prime were marked by smoke. The war was closer than ever. Yet, in the middle of that chaos, the royal palace stood mostly silent. Jean Park continued his work quietly. He repaired shattered lamps, swept the floors covered with dust, and cleared the halls of fallen banners. To most, he was invisible, a janitor who moved like a shadow. But lately, more eyes had begun to notice him. Guards nodded to him. Some whispered his name, wondering why the king let a human walk so freely through the heart of the empire. Jean didn't care for their questions. He cared only about fixing what he could. One evening, as he was scrubbing the steps leading to the throne room, the grand doors opened with a deep rumble. A guard called his name. "Human, His Majesty asked for you." Jean froze mid-swipe. "For me?" The guard nodded. "Now." Jean slowly stood, wiped his hands on his work cloth, and followed the guard to the golden doors. Inside, the throne room was dim. The great crystal pillars that once shone like suns were cracked, their glow faint. The king sat on his high throne, shoulders heavy, crown slightly tilted. Vortha's gaze lifted when Jean entered. "Come forward, human." Jean bowed deeply. "Yes, your majesty." The king studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Tell me, Jean Park, why you stay." Jean blinked. "Stay, sire?" "Yes." Vortha's deep voice echoed softly. "You have seen the palace falling apart. You have seen the people lose hope. Even now, rebellion spreads through the outer worlds. You could have escaped with the merchant ships. Yet you remain here, mopping floors while the empire burns. Why?" Jean looked at the cracked marble beneath his boots. He thought for a moment before answering. "Because someone has to clean up the mess, your majesty." Vortha's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think this is a mess?" Jean hesitated, then nodded. "A big one. But every mess can be cleaned if someone starts somewhere." For a heartbeat, the king seemed surprised. Then he gave a short, rough laugh. It was the first time Jean had ever heard him laugh. "You speak like a man who sees things simply." "Sometimes simple is all we have," Jean said quietly. "I can't fight wars or command armies, but I can fix what's broken. That's something." Vorth leaned back on his throne. "Do you believe this empire can be fixed?" Jean thought of the empty halls, the cracked stones, the hungry faces in the lower wards. "Maybe not all at once," he said, "but you could start with the people. They've stopped believing. You could change that." The king's expression turned thoughtful. "And what would you have me do? I am a ruler of worlds, not a janitor." Jean smiled faintly. "Then maybe try being both, sire." Vorth tilted his head. "Explain." "You see everything from high above," Jean said, "but you forget what it looks like down here. The floors don't clean themselves, and the cracks don't fix themselves. Sometimes you have to kneel down and get your hands dirty, even if you're a king." The room fell silent. The torches flickered along the walls. The king's gaze softened, just a little. Finally, he spoke again, quieter this time. "Your words are bold. Human. Few would dare speak so before me." "I'm sorry if I overstepped," Jean said quickly. "I mean—" Vorth raised a hand. "No, you spoke truth. My generals bring me fear. My nobles bring me lies. But you," he paused, as if surprised by his own thought, "you bring something else. Honesty." He stood from his throne, tall and broad, his dark armor glinting faintly under the lights. "Tell me, Jean Park, if you were king, what would you do first?" Jin's eyes widened. Me? A king? Yes, Vorith said. Imagine you ruled Zytherian. What would be your first command? Jin thought hard. I would open the gates, he said slowly. Let the people come in. Let them see that the king is not hiding behind walls. Vorth's brow furrowed. You would let the commoners into the palace? Yes, Jin said. When you hide, they start to believe you don't care. But if you stand with them, they'll stand with you. The king stared at him for a long time. Then he nodded once. You have given me much to think about. He turned toward the great windows overlooking the city. Fires glowed faintly in the distance. The war was coming closer. Jin bowed again and quietly stepped back toward the doors. But before he could leave, Vorth's voice called out once more. Jin Park, he said, if I lose my crown, will you still clean these halls? Jin stopped and looked over his shoulder. Yes, your majesty. Someone still has to keep them shining. A faint smile touched the king's lips. Then perhaps there is hope for this place yet. That night, Jin walked back to his small quarters feeling strange. He was only a janitor, but somehow his word had reached the most powerful being in the empire. And far above, as the twin moons shone through the broken palace windows, King Vorth stood alone before his throne, his mind heavy with the simple wisdom of a human who saw the world not as a ruler, but as a man who still believed in cleaning what was broken. The palace had never been so busy. For the first time in years, the grand gates of Zytherian were open. The great halls, once silent and cold, were filled with the sound of voices. Citizens, merchants, and soldiers alike walking through the marble corridors. The king had done what Jin Park had suggested. The change began small. At first, it was only a day of open hearing, where the people could bring their problems to palace. But that one day became 2 and then a week. Now, the palace had become something else. Not just a symbol of power, but a hope. Jin moved through the crowd quietly, still carrying his mop and bucket. He smiled as he passed the visitors. Some bowed to him now, calling him the human who spoke to the king. It made him shy, but also proud. Inside the throne room, King Vorith sat without his crown. He no longer wore the heavy armor of gold and steel. Instead, he dressed simply, dark robes with silver clasp, the mark of a ruler who worked among his people. When Jin entered the room, the king looked up and smiled faintly. You came, Vorith said. Of course, Jin said, bowing lightly. You said you needed help. The king chuckled. Help? Perhaps advice. The palace is full of people now. They talk, they argue, they ask for things. It feels chaotic. Jin looked around. Papers covered the tables, filled with requests and complaints. That's good, your majesty. It means they trust you enough to speak. Vorith sighed, leaning back. Trust is not something easily rebuilt. Not after years of silence and fear. Jin nodded slowly. Then you start by listening. The king studied him for a moment. You always make it sound simple. It usually is, Jin said with a small smile. Outside the hall, a loud voice broke their talk. A young alien soldier rushed in, armor dented, his face pale. Your Majesty, the border worlds are rebelling again. They refuse to send supplies. Vorith rose from his seat, his tall figure casting a long shadow. Then I will go to them. The soldier blinked. Personally, my king? Yes, Vorith said. If they will not come to me, I will go to them. They must see that I am not a ghost ruling from a throne. Jin looked uneasy. It's dangerous out there, sire. The king turned to him. Would you come with me, Jin Park? Jin's eyes widened. Me? Yes. You see what others do not. You speak what others will not. I could use your honesty. Jin hesitated. He was just a janitor, a man with no weapon, no armor. But the king looked at him not as a servant, but as a companion. He finally nodded. All right, your majesty. I'll come. The next morning, the royal convoy left the capital. The people lined the streets, watching as the king's ship lifted into the sky. For the first time, they saw him not as a distant ruler, but as one of them. The journey to the border worlds took days. Jin spent his time repairing parts of the ship and cleaning the decks. The alien soldiers often watched him curiously. "You really think he listens to you?" one of them asked. Gene smiled. "Sometimes. Sometimes he just hears himself through my words." When they reached the planet Verith, smoke filled the sky. The cities below burned. Angry crowds gathered near the landing site. As the king stepped out, his guards moved to shield him, but he waved them back. He walked straight toward the crowd. They shouted at him, calling him a liar, a tyrant. Gene stood a few steps behind, unsure what would happen next. Vorith raised his voice so all could hear. "You have every right to be angry," he said. "I left you in silence for too long. I forgot that a king's crown means nothing if he forgets his people. But I am here now, not to command, but to listen." The crowd grew quiet. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, holding a sick child in her arms. "You say you will listen, but my son is dying. We have no medicine. The taxes took it all." Vorith knelt before her, his great form lowering to the dust. He touched the child's forehead gently. "Then the taxes will stop," he said, "and the medicine will come from my own stores." Gasps spread through the crowd. Gene watched as the people slowly began to lower their weapons. The shouting stopped. Something had shifted, something real. Later that night, as they sat by a small campfire near the ship, Vorith looked at Gene with tired eyes. "You were right again," he said softly. Gene poked at the fire. "About what?" "About getting my hands dirty," the king said. "It's the only way to see what needs cleaning." Gene laughed quietly. "Guess being a janitor has its uses." Vorith chuckled, his deep voice echoing softly across the dark hills. "Perhaps I should give you a new title. Minister of Clean Truth." Gene shook his head. "Please don't. I like being just Gene." The king nodded. "Then just Gene, the man who reminded a king how to see." Above them, the stars of Zytherian glowed bright against the black sky. The fires of rebellion were fading, replaced by a new light, a light born from a human's simple wisdom and a king's courage to change. And as the night went on, the two sat side by side, not as ruler and servant, but as men who understood each other, bound by respect and something rare in the galaxy, trust. Years passed, and Zytherian changed in ways no one had ever imagined. The palace that once echoed with silence was now filled with laughter, music, and the sounds of life. The great marble halls, once guarded by soldiers with cold eyes, were now open to visitors and traders from across the stars. And at the center of it all, people often saw a man with gray hair, a soft smile, and a mop in his hand. Gene Park, the human janitor who had somehow become part of the legend. He still cleaned the same halls he had walked as a quiet worker. But now, wherever he went, people bowed their heads in respect. They called him a man who swept the stars, because his advice had helped clear the dust from a broken empire and made it shine again. King Vorith often found Gene in the great observatory, gazing at the distant galaxies. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the silver towers, the king entered the room. His crown was smaller now, simple, and worn more out of duty than pride. "You still clean, even when the palace gleams," Vorith said with a smile. Gene looked up, shrugging lightly. "There's always dust somewhere, your majesty, even among stars." Vorith laughed, a deep, warm sound that filled the room. "You're not wrong. But tell me, Gene, do you ever regret staying? You could have returned to Earth years ago. The ships fly that way again." Gene looked out at the stars for a moment before replying softly. "Maybe one day. But Earth had plenty of people to keep it clean. Here, I'm still needed." The king nodded. "You've taught me more than all my advisors combined. You showed me that even small hands can change a world." Just then, the great doors opened, and a young alien boy ran in, the king's son, Prince Kale. The boy was small but brave, with curious silver eyes. He carried a small broom in his hand. "Mr. Gene, Mr. Gene," the boy called, grinning. "I helped clean the garden today. The flowers look shiny now." Gene chuckled and patted the boy's shoulder. "Then you did better than me. Maybe you'll take my job one day." The boy shook his head quickly. "No, I'll be king one day. But I still want to clean things too. Like you." Vorith smiled proudly at his son. A wise goal, my son. To rule is to serve, and to serve is to clean what others leave behind. Gene felt warmth in his chest. That simple truth, the one he'd carried his whole life, had spread far beyond what he could have imagined. Later that night, Gene stood alone in the observatory. The stars stretched endlessly across the glass dome above him, each one shining like a tiny promise. He remembered the first night he had arrived at the palace, a scared human, tired and unnoticed. He had only wanted a quiet life, sweeping floors and fixing what others broke. But somehow his words, his small actions, had rippled outward. He had not just cleaned floors, he had cleaned hearts. A voice echoed softly from behind him. Gene. It was the king again, though his tone was softer than before. There's a council meeting tomorrow. They want you there. Me? Gene turned around. What would I do in a council meeting? Vorith smiled. The ministers call you the quiet voice. When arguments rise, your silence reminds them to think. Gene laughed lightly. Guess silence is still my best skill. The king's gaze grew distant. Someday, Gene, when I am gone, I hope my people remember you, not as a human janitor, but as a man who showed a kingdom how to breathe again. Gene looked down at his mop, then at the stars. If they remember anything, I hope it's that no one is too small to do something kind. The king nodded slowly. That is enough to build a universe on. The years flowed quietly after that. The palace grew even brighter. New towers were built, and ships from other worlds came seeking trade and peace. The name Zytherian became known not as a kingdom of war, but as a kingdom of wisdom. And when visitors asked what changed at all, the citizens would smile and point toward the quiet man sweeping near the fountains. That's him, they would say, the man who swept the stars. No statue was ever built in his name. No monument stood in his honor. But long after he was gone, his lessons remained, carried in every corner of the galaxy that had once been dark and proud. On the anniversary of peace, the king would always look up at the stars and whisper, "Thank you, Gene Park." Some said that on clear nights, if you looked closely, you could see a soft shimmer in the sky, a trail of light, like the sweep of a broom across the heavens. And somewhere, among the endless constellations, the spirit of a humble human janitor seemed to keep cleaning, keeping the stars bright for all who dare to look up and believe that even the smallest hands could change the fate of kings. The end.